Hi, Social Studies 20-2, taking a look at source number one. Our theme of the week is going to be internment, ultranationalism in Canada. This week we're going to do things a bit different. I'd like you to view the lesson called ultranationalism in Canada before you actually try and interpret the source. You're going to need that lesson to understand what's going on here. So assuming that you viewed the lesson, let's take a look at the source and see what we can make of it. Okay, so I've got a photograph. I remember we've talked about photographs a few times now. I've got a photograph, and the caption underneath says Ukrainian Canadians in an internment camp in Western Canada. All right, so when I study the picture, I see well, a lot of guys, a big barbed wire fence, not a normal barbed wire fence. This one's much taller. This one looks like, they're a little more worried about people getting out compared to a normal barbed wire fence. And so I'm going to couple this photograph and caption with our lesson today on ultranationalism in Canada. And of course, it's referring to the confinement, the internment of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I in Western Canada. And so what you'll want to do, let's take a look at our source analysis template. Your date, place, well, it doesn't give you a specific one, but you know that this happened during World War One. And if you listen to the lesson really closely, you'd know actually that the camps didn't close until 1920. So your date time period is 1914 through 1920. Participants obviously are going to be the Ukrainian Canadians and the Canadian government, because it's the Canadian government that enacted the War Measures Act that locked up the Ukrainian Canadians. Evidence that we would point out from the source would be, well, first of all, that barbed wire fence. And I also find it interesting that in the photograph, it's only men. And so that tells me that there must have been a male camp and a female camp, probably for the women and children. So not only were they locked up and confined, but their families were also split up as well. And I would be writing about that. As well as your evidence, you need to expand on the internment camp in Western Canada. So it's at this point you'll talk about how many, this involved. About 8,500 Ukrainian Canadians were locked up. And I talk a bit about why. Because they were labeled enemy aliens within Canada. The government wasn't quite sure of them. They didn't fully trust them. And so they were forcibly confined after their property was confiscated. All of that you would talk about under evidence. In terms of an historical case study, they gave it to you, the internment of Ukrainian Canadians during World War I. When we connect this to nationalism, I see ethnocentrism. I see that leading to discrimination and the confinement of the Ukrainian Canadians. They were never murdered en masse, so we can't call it an ethnic cleansing. I'd probably talk a bit about indoctrination, in that the government would have had to have used propaganda and that degree of indoctrination to make this happen in Western Canada and turn the public against the Ukrainian Canadians. And of course, this is a really good example of ultra nationalism in action. Anytime you confine people, you lock them up, you're committing an act of ultranationalism. Finally, for perspectives, well, I'd be thinking, what are the Ukrainian Canadians thinking about? Well, what's going through their minds? So their perspective would be one of, number one, outrage. You took my property and my possessions and gave me no money for them. You took me away from my wife and kids. I lost my farmland. Um, and as well, they're going to be really mistrustful of the government. They're going to be suspicious of the government even after this is over and they're let out. They'll probably never trust the government again. They'll be very wary in the future. So that would be the perspective of the Ukrainian Canadians. The perspective of the government would be, we're trying to protect our country. They're enemy aliens. We can't fully trust them. It is a time of war after all. We're fighting these enemies overseas. So from the government's perspective, they think that this is justified. This is something that we had to do. A third perspective you could speculate on would be the general Canadian public. What do they think about all this? They were the target of the propaganda and the fear mongering from the government after all. I wonder what they would be considering when they look at a photograph like this. I think that should do it with this source. Like I said, the theme of the week is going to be internment. A lot of people don't know that this actually happened in Canada, but it did.